There's a kind of quiet that exists only outside Buckingham Palace at 7 in the morning. Not the quiet of emptiness. The opposite, actually. It's a held-breath quiet. The kind where the city is already awake, buses grinding somewhere behind you, a pigeon doing its ridiculous strutting walk across the wet flagstone, but everyone standing at that iron fence has agreed, without saying a word, to keep their voices low. Like they're all in on something sacred and slightly intimidating, and nobody wants to be the first one to break it. I'd been standing there for 40 minutes. My feet already hurt. I'd made the catastrophic tourist decision of wearing new trainers that morning, the kind that look great in a shop and become instruments of slow torture by 7:40 a.m. I had a coffee bought from a cart 3 streets back that had gone cold somewhere between the Victoria Memorial and the fence. I was holding it anyway. Just for the warmth in my hands, really. The sky was doing that thing London skies do in October, where it can't decide between grey and white and ends up being both in the worst possible way. Flat. Diffuse. The kind of light that makes everything look a bit like an old photograph. The palace itself sat back from us, from all of us clinging to the railings, in that enormous, composed way it always does. Like it's completely indifferent to being stared at. I noticed the guard at his post before anything happened. That's the thing about those guardsmen. Bearskin hats and red tunics, standing with their rifles at their sides, faces locked in that famous blankness. You look at them and your brain does something interesting, it almost refuses to process them as people. They become architectural. Part of the gate. As fixed and symbolic as the gilded tips of the fence posts. This one was young. I could tell even with the hat. Something about the set of his jaw, the faint pink of exertion still in his cheeks from the cold. He'd been rotating his post in the slow, measured march that they do, the one that always draws phone cameras the moment it starts, and he'd just come to a stop. Standing at attention again. Back straight in a way that made my own posture feel like a personal apology. I was watching him absently, the way you watch anything when you've been standing still too long. Letting my eyes go soft. Thinking mostly about whether my left heel was going to blister. Then, a murmur moved through the crowd. Not words. Just a shift. The kind of collective intake you can physically feel, like a pressure change before a storm. Heads turned. Not toward the guard, toward the side entrance. The one slightly east of the main gate, half hidden by the curve of the wall, which I hadn't paid any attention to. A vehicle had stopped there. Black. The kind of black that isn't a color so much as an absence of everything, matte, silent, without plates visible from where I stood. A figure was moving beside it. Then, 2 figures. Then, I heard someone near me, a woman in a yellow rainmac, whisper to her husband, "That's her." I want to stop here for a second and be honest about something. I've been to London twice before. I've stood at this fence before. I've watched the changing of the guard, bought the overpriced photographs of the ceremony, felt the low distant thrum of the military band in my sternum. But I had never, not once, seen a working royal in the flesh. Never been at the right place. Never been close enough for it to feel real. So when that whisper moved through the people around me, when I saw the posture of the figures near that vehicle, the deliberate walk, the way space seemed to organize itself around one particular person, something odd happened to me. My brain went very, very quiet. The coffee cup was in my hands and I stopped feeling it. The blister on my heel stopped mattering. Even the pigeon, which had been making a nuisance of itself near a tourist's dropped croissant a few meters away, seemed to pause. Queen Camilla walked like someone who had made peace with being watched. That's the only way I can describe it. Not like a performance. Not stiff or rehearsed. More like someone who has simply done it long enough that the awareness of other eyes has been folded into the ordinary, the way a surgeon's hands move with a calm that isn't cold, just experienced. She wore a dark coat. Navy, or maybe a very deep charcoal, difficult to say in that flat October light. Her hair was, as it always is in photographs, that silvery ash color that somehow looks intentional rather than aged. She was talking to someone beside her. Low. I couldn't hear it. Whatever she was saying made the person beside her nod once. This was all within perhaps 30 seconds of the first murmur. And, then, the guard moved. Not in the ceremonial way. Not the slow mechanical turn of the rotation march that everyone photographs. This was a different kind of movement. Purposeful. He stepped 1-2 out from his mark, and his head turned toward the side entrance, toward the vehicle, toward the approaching figure of Queen Camilla and her aide. There's a protocol for this. I know that now. I didn't know it then, standing at the fence with my cold coffee and my failing trainers. But there is a very precise, very drilled protocol for when a senior royal approaches a post unannounced, or outside the expected schedule, or through an entrance that isn't the standard ceremonial approach. The guard knew the protocol. What happened next is the part that made the woman in the yellow rain mac grab her husband's arm. The guard didn't follow it. He stepped out of position, and that alone was enough to make the small crowd at the fence go absolutely, completely still, and then he did something that, in the several seconds it took me to process it, I genuinely could not categorize. He raised his hand. Not a salute. Not the ceremonial snap of military greeting. An actual, flat-palmed, stop right there raise of one hand. Extended toward the approaching queen. Like a traffic officer. Like someone used to stopping things much larger than they are and not much concerned about whether that surprises anyone. I heard someone near me pull in a breath. The aide beside Camilla stopped walking. Queen Camilla did not. She kept moving. Slower now, but forward. And her head came up, not in alarm, not in the way you'd expect someone to react to being waved to a halt by a 22-year-old in a bearskin hat, but with something more specific. A kind of sharpening of attention. The way someone looks when something unexpected has just become interesting. The guard held his position. His arm didn't drop. And, in the space between them, maybe 12 feet, maybe less, something silent and enormous was happening. I have replayed this moment probably 60 times since it happened. Because there's a thing that occurs in those few seconds that doesn't photograph well and doesn't clip well and probably won't make sense in the various versions of this story that will circulate, trimmed and captioned and reduced to a headline. It doesn't reduce. What you need to understand is that the guard wasn't panicking. I've seen people freeze. I've seen people snap to attention out of something close to terror. This wasn't either of those things. The young man's face was still blank, the professional blankness of his training, but underneath it, in the set of his shoulders, in the planted stillness of his feet, there was something else. Certainty. He had stopped the Queen of England with a raised palm and he was certain he was right to do it. And Camilla looked at him the way a person looks at something they have suddenly decided to take seriously. She stopped. Not because his hand scared her, not because she was uncertain. She stopped the way you stop when you choose to engage with something rather than walk around it. She stopped like she was leaning in. Her aide, a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd trained his entire adult life to remain professionally expressionless and was currently failing, took one small step sideways. Just one. The way a person moves when they're not sure whether to intervene and are buying themselves a half second to decide. Camilla said something to the guard. I couldn't hear it. I am maybe 30 meters away, behind iron, and she was not projecting. But I saw her mouth form words, and I saw the guard's face, that steady, blank, trained face, do something complicated. He answered her. Out loud. Standing at his post, with a raised hand, he answered the Queen. And then, everything changed. Let me tell you what I pieced together afterward. Because in the moment, I was working with fragments. A raised hand. A stopped Queen. An aide who couldn't decide what his face was supposed to be doing. A crowd of perhaps 20 or 30 people at the fence, half of them with phones already up, half of them too transfixed to remember they had phones. I was in the second group. What I didn't know, what none of us at the fence knew, was that there had been a communication breakdown somewhere inside the morning schedule. Not a dramatic one. Not a security failure. Just the ordinary, grinding friction of institutional bureaucracy applied to a royal household that runs on precision. A timetable had shifted. An expected arrival window had been amended. and the amendment, somewhere between the relevant desk and the relevant gate, had not reached this particular guardsman's briefing. He was operating on the old schedule. She was arriving 22 minutes early. In most contexts, 22 minutes is nothing. You apologize, you shuffle, you accommodate. But this is Buckingham Palace. And a royal guard at a post isn't a doorman who can shrug and wave someone through on good faith. There are procedures. There are verification steps. There are things that must happen, in a specific order, before a senior royal crosses a threshold via a secondary entrance during an off-schedule arrival, specifically because secondary entrances during off-schedule arrivals are precisely the kind of gap that people with bad intentions look for. The guard knew this. He hadn't stopped her because he didn't recognize her. He hadn't stopped her because he was confused or frightened or starstruck. He had stopped her because a stopped royal, 3 seconds of inconvenience, is always safer than a wave-through assumption. He was doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. The problem was how it looked. From where I stood, the next 2 minutes were the strangest theater I've ever witnessed. Camilla had stopped. The guard had lowered his arm, not stood down, just lowered the palm, a small physical softening that didn't actually change his position. He was speaking. She was listening. Her aide had taken out a phone or a radio, I couldn't tell from that distance, and was doing something with it rapidly, the way people do when they're fixing a thing that should not have needed fixing. The crowd at the fence had collectively stopped breathing. There was a man to my right, older, with a proper camera, the kind with a long lens, clearly a photographer of some kind, possibly press, who was shooting in total silence, not a word, just the muted mechanical shutter of his camera running. Behind me I heard a woman say, very quietly, to absolutely no one, "She doesn't look angry." And she wasn't. That was the thing. That was the thing I kept coming back to as I watched. Queen Camilla did not look angry. She looked, and, I know this sounds odd, I know it doesn't fit the expected shape of this story, she looked almost impressed. There's a face people make when something has disrupted their expectation in a way that turns out to be interesting rather than frustrating. It's a small face. Easy to miss. A slight tipping of the chin. A settling of the shoulders that's different from tension, it's the opposite, actually. Release. The loosening of someone who has been managed and deferred to and smoothly ushered for so many consecutive hours that a genuine, unscripted moment of human stubbornness is, briefly, a relief. She talked to him for perhaps 90 seconds. I know because I counted. I had nothing else to do with my hands and my brain had fixed on this like a dog with a very confusing stick. 90 seconds of what appeared to be, from 30 meters away, through iron railings, without audio, a real conversation. Not a dressing down. Not a royal dismissal. An actual exchange, where both parties were speaking and both parties appeared to be listening. The guard's face didn't change. It didn't need to. His body language changed instead. Fractionally. The difference between a man braced for impact and a man holding a position because he believes in the position. If you've ever watched someone get unexpectedly treated with respect when they were prepared to be treated with contempt, that shift. That's what I was watching. The aide finished whatever he was doing with his device. He said something to the Queen. She turned her head toward him, brief, attentive, and then turned back to the guard and said one more thing. The guard nodded once. Not a bow. Not the full formal acknowledgement that would have been appropriate given who was standing in front of him. Just a nod. Clean and direct. The kind of nod you give someone when you've reached an understanding. Then, he stepped back to his mark. And Queen Camilla walked through. This is where the story should end, probably. The scene is complete. Protocol upheld, inconvenience absorbed, everyone carries on with their morning. 30 tourists at a fence go back to their coffees and their phone cameras, and the pigeon goes back to the croissant. But there's a thing that happened in the aftermath that I haven't told you yet. It's the part that made me think about this for weeks. As she passed through into the grounds, beyond the visible line, the aide beside her and 2 figures I hadn't noticed materializing from somewhere to accompany her, she paused. 1 beat. Maybe less. She looked back at the guard. He was already back at his mark, back in his stance, face forward, rifle at his side, the architectural blankness back in place. Doing his job. Doing it the way he'd apparently been prepared to do it from the moment that unbriefed early arrival walked into his protocol zone. She didn't smile. Didn't nod. Nothing that would have read as performance or generosity from a distance. What she did was simpler than any of that. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you want them to know you noticed. 2 seconds. Then, gone. The woman in the yellow rain Mac was crying. Not dramatically. Not the ugly, heaving kind of crying that makes everyone uncomfortable. Just wet eyes, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, the other still gripping her husband's arm. The kind of crying that happens when something has moved you and you didn't have time to prepare for it. Her husband patted her hand. He looked slightly helpless, slightly moved himself, but of the generation that expresses this by becoming very interested in counting the flagstones. The man with the long lens camera lowered it finally. He looked at the screen on the back of it for a moment. Then, he looked at the gate. Then, he did a small exhale through his nose that might have been satisfaction or might have been something more complicated. I looked at my coffee. Still cold. I drank it anyway. The fallout, and there was fallout, though not the kind that word usually implies, began within the hour. Not from Camilla. Not from the palace. From the crowd. Because here's what nobody tells you about being present at a moment like this: the story starts immediately, and it starts in multiple versions, and all of them are true and none of them are complete. By the time I'd found a bench to sit on and give my feet a rest, I'd already heard 3 different accounts from people who had been standing within 10 meters of me. One woman, late 50s, American accent, wearing one of those walking holiday waterproof jackets that have approximately 40 pockets, was on the phone to someone, saying, the guard literally refused to let her in, she had to wait outside, it was unbelievable. A teenage boy nearby was showing his friend a blurry, distant-shot phone video and saying, she went off on him, look, you can see she's getting in his face. A man I recognized from the fence, gray beard, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, caught my eye when he heard the teenager. He shook his head once. Slow. The way someone does when they know what they saw and they're deciding whether to bother correcting anyone. He didn't bother. I understood that. Because the version where the guard was brave and correct and she acknowledged him with 2 quiet seconds of direct eye contact, that version doesn't compress well. It doesn't fit a headline or a caption or a 20-second clip. The texture of it gets lost the moment you try to summarize it. What happened at that gate was a small thing. It was also, depending on how you look at it, not small at all. I stayed in London for 3 more days after that. Did the usual things? Walked the South Bank until my feet filed a formal complaint. Ate a Scotch egg standing up outside Borough Market because the queue for a seat was obscene. Went to the National Portrait Gallery and spent 40 minutes in front of a painting I couldn't explain my attachment to, which I think is the only correct way to visit a portrait gallery. But I kept coming back to the gate. Not physically. I didn't go back and stand at the fence again. I mean, I kept going back to it in my head, the way your tongue keeps going to the place where a tooth was. Pressing at it. Finding the shape of the gap. What bothered me, and I don't mean bothered in a distressing way, more in the way a pebble in a shoe bothers you, a thing that demands your attention precisely because it doesn't fit neatly, was the guard's face. Specifically, the certainty in it. I've spent a lot of time in my life watching people perform certainty. I know what it looks like when someone is certain because the authority structure has backed them up and they're just riding the institutional confidence. I know what it looks like when someone is certain because they're very good at pretending and the bluff hasn't cracked yet. I know what it looks like when someone is certain because they're young enough that they haven't yet accumulated enough damage to be appropriately unsure about things. This wasn't any of those. This was the certainty of someone who had looked at a situation, understood it more completely than most of the people watching it, and was prepared to absorb whatever came next: confusion, anger, bureaucratic consequence, the weirdness of being the person who stopped the Queen because the alternative was a wrong decision. And he had no interest in making the wrong decision. That's a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. From the outside, it just looks like a young man with his arm out. On my last evening, I ended up in a pub in Pimlico. Nothing special about it. The kind of pub that doesn't try very hard and is better for it. Dark wood, old upholstery, a board menu with chips and a few things involving pie. A television above the bar showing football with the sound off. I got talking to the man beside me at the bar. The way you do. The English version of getting talking, which means you don't make eye contact first, you both stare at your drinks, and then, some ambient event, someone bumping a chair, the television doing something unexpected, provides the social permission. The ambient event was the television switching from football to a brief news segment. One of those segment within a segment updates, the 15-second ones, about royal engagements. Camilla at something. I don't remember what. A foundation event, I think, or a museum opening. She was doing the thing she does in public, gracious, warm, slightly wry. The camera loved that combination. The man beside me said, without preamble, decent woman. I said, yeah. He said, more than the job deserves, most days. And, then, he went back to his pint and, so did I. I don't know why that exchange has stuck with me as much as the gate. Maybe because it was a different kind of truth about the same thing. The gate showed one side of it, the institution, the protocol, the chain of procedure that exists to protect something larger than any individual within it. The pub showed the other side, the human being moving through a role that asks everything and footnotes nothing. The weight of the thing carried not because anyone would notice, mostly, but because it needed to be carried. Decent woman. More than the job deserves. 2 sentences. Said to no one, really. Just said. I looked up a few things when I got home. Not to fact-check my own experience, I know what I saw. But, because I needed context for the frame. The Queen's Guard protocol for unscheduled or off-schedule arrivals via secondary access points is, apparently, exactly as rigid as the Guard's behavior implied. The verification requirements aren't a formality. They're not about distrust of any particular individual. They're about the operational truth that a protocol which bends for senior royals on the inside bends for everyone eventually, and a protocol that bends for everyone eventually protects no one. He knew that. He'd been trained to know that. And, somewhere in the machinery of that morning, a schedule amendment that didn't make it through the full chain, a briefing that didn't include his post, the ordinary fracture lines that exist in every large institution no matter how much gold leaf is on the ceiling, the gap opened up. 22 minutes. Side entrance. One guard on his mark with the old information. And, he held the mark. I think about what it costs to hold a mark when the thing walking toward you is enormous and expects to be deferred to. Not because it's cruel or careless, because it has simply always been deferred to, and deference is the air it breathes and the ground it walks on, and your small arm raised in the October morning is approximately the least expected thing in its world. I think about the fraction of a second in which he must have made the calculation. Step aside. Let her through. Lose nothing visible, gain nothing visible. The morning continues. No one outside that fence would ever know. No one inside would reprimand him for it, probably the opposite, someone would probably quietly thank him for not creating a scene. Step aside. It's the easy thing. It's the path that costs least. He didn't step aside. The fallout. Everyone keeps using that word about this story, in the various versions of it that have circulated since. The fallout. As if there must be wreckage. As if a confrontation cannot exist without casualties. I want to tell you about the actual fallout. The one I witnessed with my own face pressed somewhat embarrassingly toward the railings of Buckingham Palace on a cold October morning with a cold coffee and a blistering heel. The fallout was, Queen Camilla waited 90 seconds. The fallout was, the aide made a call and fixed the gap in the schedule notification. The fallout was, the guard returned to his mark and continued his rotation, and no one who didn't already know anything would know that anything had happened at all. And the fallout was a woman in a yellow rain mac crying in a way she couldn't explain to her husband, and a man with a long lens staring at the back of his camera with an expression that held more than photographs can hold, and me on a bench with cold coffee thinking about the shape of quiet courage and how it tends to look like nothing when it's real. That was the fallout. No casualty. No wreckage. Just an institution that held because one young man in a bearskin hat decided that the correct thing mattered more than the comfortable thing, and held because the woman on the other side of his raised palm understood that distinction and met it with the one thing that would have cost her least to withhold. Acknowledgement. 2 seconds. Eyes to eyes. You noticed. I noticed that you noticed. I don't know the guard's name. I've thought about that. Whether I wish I did. Whether the story would be improved by it, personalized in some way that makes it feel more real. I don't think it would. I think there's something exact and correct about not knowing. He wasn't doing it for the story. He wasn't doing it for the recognition. He was doing it because he was at a post and something walked toward his post that didn't fit the parameters of what was supposed to walk toward his post, and he held the parameters because that's what the parameters are for. The name isn't the point. The point is what it looked like from 30 meters away, on a cold morning, when the thing you've been trained for turns out to be real, and you discover, possibly for the first time, that you were exactly the person your training meant to make. There's a photograph. The man with the long lens camera, I've never found it published. Maybe he was press and it ran somewhere I haven't seen. Maybe he was enthusiast and it lives on a hard drive somewhere in a flat in this city. Maybe the image from that distance, in that flat light, through those iron rails, didn't capture what the eye caught. Maybe it was technically fine and emotionally insufficient. That happens. The camera is faithful and stupid. It catches light and misses weight. What happened at that gate had weight. I felt it in my feet on the way back to the underground. Past the Victoria Memorial, past the tour groups gathering like slow weather, past the coffee cart where I'd bought the drink I'd been carrying for 40 minutes before I finally drank it cold. I felt it the way you feel a piece of music that hits a note you didn't know you'd been waiting for. Recognition. The sound of a thing being what it was supposed to be. The guard was what he was supposed to be. She was what she was supposed to be. And, in the gap between them, the 90 seconds and the raised hand and the conversation nobody could hear and the 2-second look on the way and something happened that I can't put a better name on than this. 2 people, standing inside the full weight of their respective roles, saw each other clearly. That's not nothing. In the cold and the grey and the flat October light outside the most photographed building in England, with a pigeon stealing someone's pastry and a crowd of strangers holding their breath, that is, in fact, everything.